our RxJS Advent calendar, day 12, I think it is. Wow, yeah, it's day 12 of going through and helping you understand RxJS from the ground up. So in the previous days, we've talked about a number of topics here. And so we've gone from creating an observable, as we've seen before, to sequences over time, and that's to involve the scheduler. Then we created observables using the standard factories of and generate and range and so forth. Then we moved over to our polling operations of filter, not sorry, the polling operations of timer and interval, and then we went into conversions of observables from other data structures, whether it was promises, it was other observables or arrays or iterables. To make it a little bit more useful, then we talked about how we moved away from the dot notation that we've used a lot of places and moved that over to this notion of pipe, which allows us to better tree shake, but also only include what you really need and want, so that your bundles are much smaller and much more pointed. And with that, of course, it makes it pretty darn explicit about what you are bringing in, what you're not bringing in, and also so that you're not just chaining onto the prototype of this object that you don't own necessarily. So there's a number of reasons why, like I said, the pipe is a lot better for at least the JavaScript world than it is for other environments. Then we had mapping and filtering. So the two most basic operations that we would want to do is to transform our to transform our input over time, and then of course filter our input over time, and that's with mapping and filtering. So then we started to focus more on the pieces where we could start to think more about popular libraries such as Redux and so on and so forth. So that's the kind of cool thing that I'm trying to kind of go through and work with today, live coding it to see how well I do or fail miserably. Luckily, I've got examples fully baked for you so that you don't struggle along with me. But reducing and scanning really is where the interesting aspects get in terms of scanning, which is basically building up your state machine over time instead of array prototype reduce and so forth, which takes all of your input and reduces it to a single value. With scan, we get incremental values over time, which allows us to build up our state machines, such as a counter or anything else, such as a shopping cart, and to-do MVC and things like that. And we'll probably do a to-do MVC using pure Rx, and we may bring in other libraries such as Redux Observable and other community libraries that are and NGRX that are fairly popular that people are using right now to do some very interesting things. So yesterday, if you tuned in, we talked about subjects, and what subjects were was the combination of our not only our observables but also our observers. So if you wanted to have something like your event emitter in Node, or even a DOM node which has add event listener, remove event listener, and emit, then it kind of falls into that same kind of bucket. In the classic subject observer style, which has the explicit adds and removes, from those particular data sources. The problem with those, of course, is the fact that they're non-compositional by their very nature. What I mean by that is that you can't easily tear down your event listener just especially if you're using fat arrow functions or lambdas or whatever you want to use, because they have different function identities. So you can't just add a fat arrow function for add event listener and expect to be able to remove it later. Instead, what we have is this notion of a subscription, and the subscription is sort of an aggregate teardown where we can build up these larger subscriptions over time to be able to tear them down all deterministically so that there aren't any leaks. And that's true for pretty much any part of Rx, is you get that deterministic teardown, whether you're removing event listeners or that you're doing something else, such as clearing an interval, clearing a timeout, or any other network operation, for example. So we talked about subjects, and the very basic one being the RxJS subject. And that's just a simple in and out kind of thing. There's really nothing more to it, except for the fact that these are considered hot by default, as all subjects are, in that if you're emitting data to them and not listening to it on the other side with subscribe, then you're going to possibly miss data. And that hot and cold dichotomy is there, where just like with event listeners and everything else, is if you're not listening, then on any particular thing you miss that particular data, as opposed to the very deterministic or cold observables such as of or from or anything else that well, maybe not from, but depending on the iterable or data source that you're dealing with. But if it's coming from an array or something deterministic that you call subscribe to each and every time, you'll get the same results. And that's certainly not the case for observables and hot observables. So for example, here when we say event next with hello and then we subscribe, we're going to completely miss this one here. That's not necessarily a cool thing to have happen to you. So you have to kind of be careful about what you're trying to do. But there are ways around this, obviously. We don't totally give you a nice foot gun and not give you a way to at least put a safety on. In that, we give you the replay subject, and kind of recapping that is that we will give you a way to, over time, say I want to replay all of the data that's ever started from the beginning of time when I created my particular subject. And you can also time box it or count box it so that it doesn't grow infinitely. The last thing you'd want to do is replay all of your mouse movements from the beginning of time on your web app and keep those mouse events in memory. So obviously you'd want to think a little bit more about how you want to hold the data, but for the simple cases it just works. And then the async subject, where you're more along the lines of caching data as it happens, and then being able to repeat that same cache data everywhere else as if it were the result of some sort of async computation. What the downside of this, of course, is the retry and replayability is just not there, is because once that value is there and resolved, much like a promise, it's set in stone. There's no changing it. So when people use an async subject, you better know that if you're going to have any errors, that you just can't recover from them in such a way that you can say retry. And finally, the behavior subject, which is One of the more interesting ones is the fact that it's basically like a subject, but starts off with an initial value. So, for example, if you had a cart, shopping cart with an initial thing, or a counter with an initial value, the first time you call subscribe on that, you get that initial value immediately. Whereas with a subject, you would have to call next with any given value. So I wanted to talk first off about after this is this library called Redux, and Redux is very interesting in terms of it's a way of dealing with state and state over time in such ways that you have stores and you have actions, and that these stores are basically these state machines that control what kind of state we have over time, and then these actions that we have are those that tell the reducer what exactly we should be doing. So in the case of a simple increment and decrement, we would the actions would be increment and decrement, and the reducer itself would be to modify the state in some sort of way, or rather not modify it, but send a new state along with the old state, just to say, okay, we're replacing 0 with 1 or 0 with 2. Whatever it happens to be, you can replace your state at that point. So it's very easy to get started with. They have some starter kits that give you a lot of things to get started with. So just to kind of give you an idea of getting started with Redux, we can implement the create store Redux example. And we'll go ahead and do this in code just to show you exactly what we're capable of doing. So let's switch over to some code and show you exactly what we can do there in terms of Redux. So switching over to code, we have kind of a bare bones thing where I kind of like to have TypeScript types to at least tell me what I'm doing along the way. So we could now have our counter store, and our state here is going to be our initial state, or we call this Redux state, and this Redux state will have an initial value of initial state. Okay, and then we can have an action here. What's this complaining about? Is only, we won't worry about that yet. And this is a Redux state. Cool. All right, so now we'll just switch on the action dot on our action dot type. Oh, sorry, that's Redux action, not Redux state. Okay, so we will switch on that, and we'll say case of our action type of increment. What would we do? Since we're returning our value, we are going to want to return a new version of that particular state. So we would say return, and because I like frozen objects, we can give say object freeze, and then say the new value happens to be our state dot value plus 1. All right, so we'll have that. Now we'll have case decrement, action type dot decrement, and return object dot freeze here with our new value here, and that is our state dot value minus 1. Cool, and then just for default sakes, we can just return state. All right, So that's pretty simple in terms of what a reducer in here looks like. So once again, it takes in our state, which is our initial state, and then our actions that come through. What we also have the ability to do is kind of like a behavior subject. We'll be able to get the store. So let's create a store here. Equals create store. And since we have create store from Redux, we can do that. And passing in our counter. So what does the store give us that's interesting? So the store itself has a number of methods. One is get state, and then the other is dispatch, which is the idea of telling to dispatch any particular message that comes through and say, hey, Redux action of foo needs to happen. Get state is another piece which allows us to get the current state of our object, and in a way, it's kind of like a behavior subject, which is why I wanted to cover subjects beforehand. So it's a subject where you can kind of just look at the value via get value, but they have here get state. So hypothetically, I could just go through and say get state at any point. But why don't I go ahead and create a renderer, and a renderer function is not going to do all that much versus if you're using React and React DOM, you would probably have some sort of JSX or something else that's telling yourself to re-render. So we can just say console.log, and we'll just say rendered value is, and then we'll reach into our store and get the states and get in particular the value. So that's cool that we can do that, and then we can just call render function here, which will immediately get us the state. And what we can also do is in the future we can subscribe, so we can say const unsubscribe. And remember how I said that that the pieces of Redux and other libraries look exactly like observables? Well, that's not unintentional, in that we can say store.subscribe, and what happens here is that we get a listener and return void. So there's no, it takes no parameters, and it sets nothing, it returns nothing here. So we've got our render method here. All right, so now that we've got our render method, what we can start doing is dispatching messages directly to our to our piece here. So we could say store.dispatch, and we'll give it a type of action type dot increments. Okay, and then we'll later on say store.dispatch type, and this will be of increment again, because why not? Action type dot increment. All right, cool. So let's go and run this, and so we can say npx ts node of 12 scratch.ts. Ta-da! All right, so we've got our, we called our initial render here, which gave us a value of 1, and then the subscribe here, every time that the action changed via the dispatch, this render gets called again with our change state. So then we can once again just go through here and copy and paste and just say decrement, and once again we'll just go from 0, 1, 2 down to 1 again. So like I said, pretty simple stuff that we're talking about here. So what happens if I wanted to do something like use Rx instead? Because, like we said, it is possible to distill our particular Redux style pattern into pretty much the same pattern, just using out of the box RxJS. Nothing really different about it, and you'll see the code change side by side as we do it. So instead of creating store from Redux, why don't we just say import our good friend subject, our happy little subject from RxJS. And then we can also import scan, our friendly operator that we talked about in a couple episodes ago, and we'll pick that up from the RxJS operators. So we can do that now. So a lot of this actually won't change all that much. What changes is here. All right, so instead of creating a store, we will create instead a subject, and we can use any number of types here, but we'll just say const store, and just because I'm using finish notation, we'll be able to do some really interesting things. No, we won't. It's just I not async subject. I said subject. All right. Stop trying to be helpful here. All right. So I got a subject here of a Redux action, because what are we sending on next is nothing more than these pieces of data, which is our rendering action. Then what we need to do is we need to reduce our particulars into our renderer. To do that, we can say const unsubscribe is equal to then we can have store dollar dot and let's do dot pipe and scan, and our counter function is our scan function, and we can have some initial state if we want to. Otherwise, we could say start with if we wanted to, but it's really not necessary if you don't want to have it. But let's do that anyways. Let's do start with. Let's bring in start with here. And sorry, so now we can do scan with our counter, and then we can do start with initial state. All right, cool. Now then we can subscribe to that, and this will be calling our new render function, and so we can just say I like to give either a partial observer or a function with next, but let's just give it with our next objects, because I just like to be fairly retentive about those sorts of things. So what actually happens in our subscribe here is that we're going to be calling render. So render is not going to be this thing anymore. It's actually going to be now our Redux state. So it changes just a little bit in the fact that we now get our Redux state here in here. So we can now say, instead of calling store.getState.value, we can just call state.value. All right, and then since we've got our unsubscribe and our render, so instead of saying store.dispatch, we can just take this with our finish notation, and instead of calling dispatch, we call next. Okay, so increment and decrement. Running this, what happens? Ooh, 0 undefined and not a number. All right, what did I do wrong here? All right, so we get the first one, which is our 0, and otherwise, all right, so I'm going to cheat a little bit and figure out what the heck I did. Redux state is equal to that, store.next. What did I do wrong? Oh, darn. So 0 and undefined and not a number is definitely not cool here in terms of creating a value here. So let's just go ahead and run back through through our predefined one, because like I said, is sometimes demos go bad and live coding can go bad here. So I'm just going to, I can do here is start with and pass in our initial state. Okay. Now let's try running it on index.ts. There we are. All right, so there we were able to increment and decrement, so rendering changes, so let's get rid of that. There was probably a typo somewhere. All right, so anyways, now with here, we're able to, let's get rid of that, then just, we don't need an initial state. No, we do need an initial state, never mind. And we could have fixed that by actually saying is equal to initial states. All right, so doing that, then there we are. Okay, so that was my boo-boo there. Let's see if we take that away. Does that do anything? Yeah, okay, so that was my fault. So now, since we have our start with initial state, that will trigger that render that first time. And so in fact, my code was correct. It's just that I forgot that I could do initial state and non-initial state. My bad. In reality, our code is exactly the same on one and the other, in that we can say start with and initial state here. And like I said, it's live coding is always an adventure, especially when you're trying to change things on the fly, like I'm doing here. npx ts node and 12 scratched. Oh, sketch. Wow, my spelling is really atrocious, and I do appreciate all of the pull requests that I have been getting. So there you go. So this forces the initial state. This is our scan, which comes through with our initial state and our starting value. And then, like I said, is we come through increment, and then decrement. So really, that's about it in terms of what I wanted to show you code-wise, that you too could implement something very, very similar to Redux. And we'll dive deeper in subsequent sessions on how to do this. But what's really cool is the fact that we now have the ability to do that pretty easily. So we can look at the idea of using Redux observables. So the idea of doing a middleware approach, middleware for Redux. So there's certainly that with being able to use all of these extra features where you can inject Rx and Redux kind of together in such a way. And then of course there's NGRX as well, which has its own store concepts and so forth. So we have the reactive libraries for that, NGRX itself, so you can go to ngrx.io, and it's reactive state for Angular in particular. So if you wanted to manage state here, you've got largely a lot of the same possibilities that you have in Redux, but it's Rx based. So once again, very cool. They have really cool graphics, and that always makes a project better or worse, obviously. So unless there are any questions in the feed, I think we can leave this episode here at our 30-minute mark as per usual. Once again, thank you all for coming today. If you like what you see, do hit me up here on Twitch, Bluer than Blue Falcon, aka Matt Podwysocki. We have myself at Twitter at Matt Podwysocki, MattPodwysocki, and of course you can also find these videos are also uploaded later onto YouTube. So thank you all very much, and I will see you next time. And don't forget to subscribe and watch more of these videos as they come out. Thanks. Bye.